Okay, so the final key motivation for moving into a site-specific context that I'm talking about today is the desire to reach a new type of audience. Now, I've spoken before about how there's a kind of mainstream theatre culture that goes on and has always gone on for hundreds of years. There's a kind of a moderate practice that just keeps where a certain type of audience will always attend and a certain type of work will always be made, and that remains true today as it did 200 years ago, or even further back than that. But there are always sort of countercultures going on, theatre makers who actually question, is the audience that goes to the Edinburgh Lyceum or the Glasgow Citizens Theatre really the audience that I'm actually trying to speak to? And it may well be. I'm not knocking normal theatre goers. We need them and we welcome them. But there are companies out there who say, well, actually, what about reaching a different type of audience? And it's similar with the protest motivation that I just spoke about, where people are actually targeting, they're going after organisations, or they've got a message, or they're there to protest, they're there with a purpose. It's similar to that. There's plenty of companies who have started from the question of who is it that I'm trying to reach with my work, and are we reaching the right people? And I've got a couple of examples to talk about here. You've got Brithgoff, who is Mike Pearson, who is literally the guy who wrote Site-Specific Performance. He's like the legend, who I had the privilege of working with during my master's year down at Aberystwyth. Name drop again. And he started up Brithgoff, Brithgof, with a woman called Liz Hughes Jones in the early 1980s. And they started from the premise, they're working in Aberystwyth in Wales, and if you've ever been to Aberystwyth, you'll realise that it's a small little seaside village in West Wales that it takes miles to reach the next town. And that's the thing about Wales, similar to Scotland, is that of course you've got your big cities, your hubs, your Glasgows, your Edinburghs, your Cardiffs, your Swanseas, but there are loads of little towns dotted about, and Aberystwyth is one of these little towns. And there's even more rural communities around Aberystwyth. And they were, and Mike Pearson and Liz Hughes Jones started from the premise of saying, well, there really isn't many municipal theatres in Aberystwyth. There is the Arts Centre, and I don't even know if that was open at the time when they first started. And they basically, it was born not from a desire like the Dadaists or the creatives in 1950s America. Their starting point wasn't, I want to create a new form of theatre, I want to develop a new practice. Their starting point was literally, there is no theatre spaces in Wales, we better find some. And so they started looking for locations places that had high enough ceilings that they could rig lights. So they found a barn, for example, or a place that they could get an audience on three sides, so they got a cattle market. And it was from searching for these types of locations that they started to identify, well, actually, what we're doing here, should we be taking versions of Shakespeare, or should we be doing that type of work in those locations, or should we be trying to make work that speaks to the audience situated around the location that we choose to work in? So they would say they chose a cattle market, they would be looking at that and saying, right, well, who have we got, who can we invite to this audience, and what can we do it about? And it was literally the desire to reach new audiences, to find new venues, to create work in that spurned on site-specific theatre as we know it today. And Brithgoff really should be attributed as being the kind of modern masters. The way they developed their work right up until the mid-90s, and the way that Mike is still developing work today, was incredibly innovative, where it was merging all sorts of different layers of materials. They were one of the first companies that you could call total theatre, where text in the body is only seen as an a layer equal to the site, equal to the architecture, equal to the lights, the sound, and you would look at their work as a series of tracks, an amalgamation, collection of materials that were all playing together. And they developed some really, really exciting works like Pax and Godothin, that I'll probably talk to you about later on. I might do an artistic profile on Brythgoff because there's so much to talk about them. So yeah, but it was born from this desire of reaching audiences, for saying there really is only a couple of municipal theatres in this wide area, and there is thousands of Welsh people who are just not getting the experience of theatre because there's no places to do it in. Or there are places to do it in, it's just that nobody's doing it. And it just took a company like Brythgoff to find those and take the theatre there. And of course they got multiple responses from their work, that people were either really happy to have a company to come and experiment, and who were interested, locals that were flattered by the interest in their community. And of course there was people who were saying, why the hell would you want to make stuff in a cattle market, you know? So there's interesting dynamics there, but it does start from the premise, let's go and find new places, let's reach new audiences. And a similar thing could be said for 784 Company, who you have already researched last year in the theatre course that you did in this second semester at Glasgow. So, but I mean, it's a similar idea. When 784 set out with their Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, they made a very conscious decision to not just play the theatres in Glasgow. They were talking about the Highland clearances, and they were talking about some very difficult content, and they wanted to take that material to the people who live there now, up into Aberdeenshire, to places like Banff and Buckie and Portsoy, and playing little town halls. Now again, when I go on to talk more about the different modalities of site-specific work and the different forms that it might take, there might be a bit of a debate as to whether you can call 784's work site-specific. But nevertheless, it was located, it's place-sensitive, it was targeted. They were going to these little Aberdeenshire towns and up in the Highlands, up in the West Highlands, so that they could take work that was tailored, written and performed for that audience in those little places. So although Brythgoff and 784 are quite different politically, quite different in the forms that they make, they're both driven by a desire to produce work for new audiences. Okay, and I think that wraps that up. I don't really need to bang on too much about that. So just as a brief recap, the key question here: what were the historical motives for moving into a site-specific context? And I would say those motives would be to make a point, to reach a different audience, to control the form and content of their work, to have artistic freedom, as makers of this kind of work, when we start developing our practice for the Bushimo project, we really need to consider why we're choosing a site. Why is it that we're going there? What is it we're working with? For what purpose are we making work there? Is it for a site's particular form? Is it for a particular audience? Or do we have a particular message that we want to convey in that place? So these are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking when we're doing it. But I think I feel bad because I know that there's probably an awful lot more to say about the historical context of site, site-specific theatre. There's a book here. If I could, where did I put it? Oh. Well, I had a book called Radical Street Performance that I was reading earlier on, that I've clearly just thrown away somewhere and can't find. But it's an entire book dedicated to discussing all the different types of radical street performance that happen. And I know I skipped over the stuff about the kind of, Chinese and Russian agitprop stuff. I just completely skated over that because I don't really have an awful lot of information about it. But that book certainly gives far more detail into those things. So I hope it kind of gives a context. I want to reiterate again that we shouldn't try and look at these things in a sort of linear form. Of course, all these things, it's like a network. They're all connected in some way, some abstract, some directly. The Dadaists connect directly to the neo-avant-garde because some Dadaists like Marshall Duchamp did move to New York, and obviously that must have had an impact in the artistic environment there. But it's not really measurable. We can't actually measure it like with a social science, like quantify what impact these things had on each other. All we know is that there was a social situation, especially during that decade in the 60s, a liminal stage where we were moving into a more left-wing, socially conscious society, and artists were responding to that move with dynamic and interesting work, which included the move into a site-specific context for all the reasons that we've just mentioned. So I think that wraps up this little section. Next I will move on to how we define site-specific performance and the problems with trying to define site-specific performance. Okay, cheers guys.